3 haunting, true small-town horror stories. Story 1. The Painted Smile. The town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had always been the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Quiet streets. Kind neighbors. The type of place where parents let their children play outside until the streetlights came on. But that all changed on a cold November night in 1998, when Sarah Mitchell learned that evil does not need to come from far away. Sometimes it lives right next door. Sarah was working the night shift at Millbrook Regional Hospital as a psychiatric nurse. She had been doing this job for 12 years, long enough to develop the kind of emotional armor that comes from dealing with human suffering every single day. She had seen addiction, mental breakdown, depression so deep it seemed to swallow people whole. She thought nothing could shake her anymore. She was wrong. It was 3 in the morning when she made her routine rounds on the acute care ward. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Most patients were asleep, their troubled minds finally finding peace in medicated dreams. As Sarah walked down the corridor, she noticed something wrong. One of the doors was open when it should have been closed. Room 247, the room where they kept their most difficult case. Her heart started beating faster as she approached. Something in her gut told her to call for backup, but she did not listen to that voice. She had made this walk 1,000 times. She was brave. She was professional. She was very, very stupid. When she looked through the doorway, Sarah saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her colleague James was lying on the floor with his legs stretched out into the hallway. His body was completely still. Blood pooled around his head. From inside the room came a sound that Sarah would later describe as the most terrible thing she had ever heard. It was not a scream. It was not quite a voice at all. It sounded like the noise a wounded animal makes when it is dying slowly. She ran backward, her hands shaking so badly she could barely reach the emergency button. Within seconds, the alarm was ringing through the entire hospital. Doctors and nurses came running. What they found in that room was beyond anything their training had prepared them for. The patient, a woman named Margaret Yates, had used a bed frame support to attack James. She had beaten him until he stopped moving. But worse than the violence itself was what came after. Margaret had apparently spent the next hour carefully arranging James' body, and then sitting beside him, perfectly calm, waiting for someone to find them. When the staff burst through the door, they found her sitting cross-legged next to James, staring at nothing. Her face was completely blank, but the real horror came when Margaret finally spoke. She opened her mouth and began to laugh. It was not a normal laugh. It was mechanical, repetitive, wrong. Then she started to talk. She said she could see people. Lots of people. Hundreds of them. She said they were standing all around the room, watching, waiting. She said they had told her to hurt James. She said the voices had been getting louder every day, filling her head like water filling a cup, and the only way to make them stop was to do what they asked. For 3 days after this incident, Margaret refused to speak to anyone. She sat in her locked room and stared at the ceiling. On the 4th day, the nurses heard her screaming. When they rushed to her room, they found her doing something that froze their blood. She was using her fingernails to scratch her own face repeatedly. The scratches formed a pattern. They formed a smile. A horrible, exaggerated smile stretching from ear to ear. Sarah Mitchell never returned to work at the psychiatric ward. The image of Margaret's face covered in blood, frozen in that impossible smile, visited her every night in her dreams. She would wake up in the darkness of her bedroom and swear she could still hear that mechanical laughter echoing down the hospital corridor. Margaret Yates remained in the psychiatric hospital for 40 years. She was diagnosed with severe schizophrenia combined with psychotic episodes. She continued to draw on her walls every night, creating complex patterns and designs that nobody could understand. Staff members noticed that the most common shape she drew was a smile, the same painted smile she had scratched into her own face. The worst part of Sarah's story came 5 years later. She was driving home from a grocery store when she saw Margaret's face on the evening news. Margaret had been released on a work program for good behavior. She was considered stable. She was going to get a job in a local office building. Sarah pulled off the road, her hands shaking. She called the police. She called the hospital. She tried to warn people. Nothing happened. The system had rules. Margaret had served her time. She had not hurt anyone else in 5 years. There was nothing they could legally do. Sarah moved away from Millbrook that very week. She never went back, and to this day, she wonders if Margaret is out there somewhere, working in an office building, walking down a quiet street, smiling that wrong smile at strangers. Story 2. The Woman in the Basement. The small town of Hickory Grove, West Virginia, sits in a valley surrounded by mountains that look like sleeping giants. The mountains have kept secrets for hundreds of years. In 1987, they kept a terrible secret for one family, a secret that nobody in Hickory Grove was prepared for, a secret that would change the town forever and make people question everything they thought they knew about their neighbors. The Hartman family had always been different. Thomas Hartman was a quiet man who kept to himself. He worked at the coal processing plant 2 towns over and came home every evening to his house on Maple Street. The house was an old Victorian mansion that had belonged to his family for generations. It was the kind of house that children in the neighborhood said was haunted. They would dare each other to run up to the front porch and then run away. None of them knew how right they were. Thomas lived there with his wife Marie, or at least that was what everyone in town believed. Marie was a woman who almost nobody in Hickory Grove had ever actually seen. She did not go to the store. She did not go to church on Sundays like the other wives did. She did not go to the beauty salon or attend the town gatherings in the spring. She stayed in the house, always in the house. The curtains were always drawn. The windows were always dark. It was as if the house had swallowed her and would not let her back out. Sometimes people who walked past the house would hear music coming from inside. Classical music, the kind of music that belonged in concert halls, not in quiet family homes. They would hear it at strange hours. 2 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, 5 in the morning. The music would stop suddenly as if someone had just turned it off, and then there would be silence so complete that it seemed unnatural. Their son, David, was homeschooled. Nobody knew very much about David either. He was 17 years old, tall and thin, with pale skin that never seemed to see sunlight. He had the kind of eyes that did not look at you normally. When he looked at you, it felt like he was looking through you, past you into some part of you that you did not want anyone to see. The kids at school talked about him sometimes when they saw him on the rare occasions he left the house. They said he was creepy. They said there was something very wrong with his family. They said the house on Maple Street was wrong somehow. But in Hickory Grove, people minded their own business. They did not ask questions. They did not stick their noses where they did not belong, so nobody ever found out. The neighbors began to notice small things over the years. Strange smells coming from the house, sounds of crying at night, a woman's voice screaming, but so distant and muffled that it sounded almost like imagination. But they said nothing. They minded their business. Then, on a night in November 1987, when a terrible storm was sweeping through the valley with rain so heavy it seemed to come from another world, everything changed. Lightning was flashing across the sky almost constantly. Thunder was shaking the houses so hard that pictures fell off walls. The wind was screaming through the streets like something alive and hungry. One of the neighbors, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Hughes, called the police. She said there had been screaming coming from the Hartman house, not the screaming of one person. The screaming of many people, different voices, men and women. Some of them sounded young. Some of them sounded very old. Some of them did not sound entirely human. Mrs. Hughes said she had lived next to that house for 5 years and had never heard anything like it. She said she was frightened. She said her children were frightened. She said something terrible was happening in that house and someone needed to do something about it right now. The police officers who arrived at the scene were not prepared for what they would find. Officers James Wilson and Donald Peters pulled up to the dark house on Maple Street. The rain was still coming down in sheets. The wind was still howling through the trees. and the front door of the house was hanging wide open, just hanging there, swinging slightly in the wind. Like an invitation, the officers looked at each other. They did not say anything. They just got out of their car and walked toward the house. When they reached the front door, they noticed something that made their skin go cold. There was blood on the door frame. Not a lot of blood, but enough. Enough to tell them that something very bad had happened inside this house. They went inside carefully, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house smelled wrong. It smelled like unwashed bodies and something else. Something that smelled like decay, like meat that had been left in the sun too long, like things dying slowly in the dark. As they moved through the house, they saw that it was almost empty of furniture. The living room had nothing in it but a couch and a television. The kitchen had a table and chairs, but almost no food. It was as if the family had removed everything unnecessary, as if they were living in an empty shell. But when they got to the basement door, everything changed. The officers opened the door slowly. They could hear something now. A sound like something moving in the dark. A sound like something breathing. They turned on their flashlights and pointed them down into the basement. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The basement was not like any basement they had ever seen. It was a place of nightmares. The concrete floor was stained with dark marks that they immediately knew was blood. In the basement, they found cages. Real cages built from wood and metal bolted to the concrete floor. There were cages large enough for a person to stand up in, and cages so small that a person would have to curl up like a child to fit inside them. There were chains hanging from the ceiling. There were leather straps bolted to the walls. There were photographs on the walls. Hundreds of photographs. Officer Wilson approached the cages slowly. When he got close enough to look inside them, he felt his stomach turn. Inside the largest cage, huddled in the corner like an animal, was an old woman. She was so thin that she looked like a skeleton covered with paper-thin skin. Her hair was completely white and hung down her back like a ghost. Her eyes were open, but they did not seem to see anything. Her fingernails were broken and caked with dried blood. She was wearing what looked like it had once been a nightgown, but it was so dirty that you could not see what color it had originally been. The officer's first instinct was to open the cage, but he did not. Instead, he called for an ambulance. He called for backup. He called for the FBI, because he knew immediately that this was something much bigger and much worse than anything he had ever encountered before. As the other officers arrived and began their investigation, they discovered something that would make the case even more disturbing. In the master bedroom, they found Thomas Hartman. He was hanging from a rope tied to the ceiling. He had taken his own life, apparently only hours before the police arrived. His body was still warm. His face was purple from the strangulation. His eyes were bulging out of his head as if he was still experiencing the horror of death. On a table beside the bed, they found a handwritten note. It was just a few lines. It said, "I cannot live with what I have done. I cannot live with what I am. I am sorry, but I am not sorry enough to stop." But Thomas Hartman was not the only dead person in the house. As the officers continued to search the basement, they found something that made even the most experienced officers turn away in disgust. In the corner of the basement, locked in one of the smaller cages, they found the remains of 2 other people. They had been dead for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Their bodies were severely decomposed. The bones were starting to show through what was left of the flesh. There were insects living inside the bodies. The smell was beyond description. As the investigation continued, the police and the FBI agents who arrived at the scene began to understand the horrifying truth. The old woman in the cage was not actually the wife of Thomas Hartman. She was his mother. Her name was Marie Hartman. She was 84 years old. She had been living in that basement for 32 years. She had not seen the outside world since 1955. She had not felt sunlight on her face in 32 years. She had not breathed fresh air or heard the sounds of the town or seen another human being besides her son and the other people he brought to the basement. The police tried to talk to Marie, but she would not speak. She just sat in the corner of the cage and rocked back and forth. She made sounds like an animal. Low moaning sounds. Sounds of pain that had no words. The photographs on the walls told the story of what had happened during those 32 years. They showed Marie in different states of distress and suffering. Some showed her crying. Some showed her sleeping on the floor of the cage. Some showed her eating from a bowl like a dog. Some were so disturbing that the police officers had to leave the room and go outside to be sick. The photographs seemed to document every year of her imprisonment. They showed her getting older and thinner. They showed her mind breaking piece by piece. They showed her becoming less human with each passing year. The investigators eventually determined that Thomas had brought other people to the house over the years. How many people, nobody would ever know, but they found evidence of at least a dozen different people. Different size clothes, different jewelry, different hair samples. People who had disappeared from the town and surrounding areas over the past 20 years. People who were never found. People whose families still wondered what happened to them. Some of those people had been in the basement for years. Some had been there for only a few days before Thomas killed them and put them in the cages to rot. When they finally got Marie out of the basement and into the hospital, her physical condition was shocking. She weighed only 75 pounds. She had severe muscle atrophy. Her bones were brittle and fragile. Her teeth had rotted away and fallen out. Her eyesight had deteriorated so badly from living in darkness that she could barely see. She had scars covering almost every part of her body. Some of the scars were old, going back years. Some were fresh. Her fingernails had been removed at some point, leaving only stumps at the ends of her fingers. But the physical injuries were nothing compared to what had happened to her mind. Marie was completely broken. She did not speak. She did not make eye contact. She would not eat unless the food was put on the floor in front of her. She would not use a toilet. She had to be relearned how to do every basic human function. Doctors said her mind had fragmented. She was not one person anymore. She was a collection of broken pieces. They were not sure she could ever be put back together. The most disturbing part of her rescue was her mental state. Marie did not want to leave the basement. When the paramedics carried her up the stairs, she screamed and fought them. When they brought her out into the light, she covered her eyes and cried. She asked them to take her back down. She said the basement was her home. She said the outside world was too bright and too loud and too scary. She said after 32 years of darkness, the light hurt her eyes so much that she wanted to die. She said she did not know how to live in the world anymore. She said she had forgotten how to be a person. David Hartman disappeared on the night of the police raid. When the officers went to find him, his room was empty. His window was open. His bed was unmade. He just vanished into the night like a ghost. The police searched for him for years, but they never found him. Some people in Hickory Grove say he ran away into the mountains. Some people say he just kept running and never stopped. There is an old story that hikers sometimes report seeing a tall, thin figure moving through the forest at night. He never makes a sound. He never comes close to them. He just watches from between the trees, his pale face and empty eyes staring at them with an expression that cannot quite be understood. Marie is still alive today. She lives in a protected facility in another state, where nobody knows her story and nobody asks questions, but she still does not like the light. She still does not like to go outside. The windows in her room are kept covered. The lights are kept dim. She spends most of her time sitting in the dark, rocking back and forth, making those low animal sounds. Doctors say she will never be able to leave this facility. Her mind belongs to that basement now. The basement took her when she was a young woman, and it kept her for 32 years. The basement changed her into something that cannot live in the world of normal people. The basement took her, and it will never give her back. Story 3. The Thing That Comes in the Rain. The town of Ravensfield, North Carolina is built on the edge of a dark pine forest. At night, the forest seems to press in against the town like it is trying to push its way back inside. The people of Ravensfield have lived next to that forest for 300 years, and they know better than to go into the woods after sunset. In 1992, nobody was more certain of this rule than Officer Richard Crawford. He had been a police officer in Ravensfield for 23 years. He knew every street, every family, every secret that the town kept hidden. He knew about drunk husbands and cheating wives and teenagers stealing from stores. He knew all the small crimes and small sins, but he did not know about the thing that lived in the forest. It started on a night when a terrible storm came rolling down from the mountains. The rain was coming so hard that it seemed like the sky was trying to wash the town away. Officer Crawford was about to go off duty when he got a call. A woman's voice on the phone said that something strange was happening on Ridgemont Road. She said there was a sound, a howling sound that did not sound like any animal she had ever heard. She said her children were frightened. She wanted him to come and check it out. Officer Crawford drove out to Ridgemont Road even though he was tired and wanted to go home and see his own family. He was a good officer. He took the job seriously. When he arrived at the address, he found the woman standing on her porch with her 3 children. She pointed toward the forest and said the sound had been coming from that direction. The sound had stopped now, she said, but something felt very wrong. Something felt like it was watching them. Officer Crawford was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in things that went bump in the night. He believed in facts and evidence and logical explanations. But when he shined his flashlight into the forest, he felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. There was something in those trees. He was certain of it. He could not see it. He could not hear it anymore. But he could feel it looking at him with an intelligence that was utterly wrong. He told the family to go inside and lock their doors. He told them to stay away from the windows. He said he would patrol the area. They did not need to worry. But worry they did. They watched from inside as Officer Crawford stood on their lawn in the pouring rain, his flashlight pointed at the dark forest, standing absolutely still as if he was listening to something that nobody else could hear. At some point during that night, something happened to Officer Crawford. Nobody will ever know exactly what. The family watched him standing there for about an hour. Then they fell asleep. When they woke up the next morning, Officer Crawford was gone. His police car was still parked outside. His radio was still in the car. His gun was still in its holster. His coat was still in the car. But Officer Crawford himself had simply vanished. The police search that followed was the largest search the county had ever organized. They brought in dogs. They brought in volunteers. They dragged the forest in all directions. They found nothing. No body, no bones, no clothing, no trace of Officer Crawford at all. It was as if the man had simply evaporated. 3 days later, Officer Crawford walked out of the forest on the other side of town. He was dirty and wet and confused. He said he could not remember where he had been. He could not remember what had happened. He said he had lost 5 days, but when the calendar was checked, he had only been missing for 3 days. He had somehow lost 2 days of his life. Officer Crawford was never the same after that night. He started acting strange. He would stare at nothing for hours. He would draw pictures at his desk of things that did not make sense. Strange shapes, patterns that hurt the eye when you looked at them too long. Eventually, he had to stop working. He was put on psychological leave. 1 month later, Officer Crawford walked into the woods again. This time he did not come back. They found his body 3 weeks later. He was lying beside a tree and he had something in his mouth. The doctor who examined the body said he had swallowed river stones. Dozens of river stones. His stomach was completely full of them. The doctor said the man must have wanted to be heavy. He must have wanted to sink. He must have wanted to go down into the dark water and never come back up. In the final report, they ruled it suicide. But the truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that Officer Crawford had brought something back with him from the forest that night. Something that did not belong in the world of light and reason. Something that had gotten into his head and lived there, feeding on his sanity, growing stronger every day. The people of Ravensfield have a saying now. They say that on stormy nights, if you hear a howling sound coming from the forest, do not answer. Do not call the police. Do not go outside. Stay inside with all your doors locked and all your lights on. Stay inside and wait for the storm to pass. Because there is something in that forest that has learned what human beings taste like. And it is always hungry. Sometimes, on the worst nights, when the rain comes down so hard that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face, the townspeople report hearing a voice that sounds like Officer Crawford. It is calling from the forest. It is calling people by their names. It sounds sad and lonely and desperate. It sounds like it just wants someone to come outside and join it in the rain. And on those nights, the people of Ravensfield turn up their television sets and hold their children close. And they pray that nobody is foolish enough to answer that call. Because if you answer, if you go out into that rain, then you too might disappear into the dark trees. And you might spend 5 days in there, or you might spend 5 years. Time does not work right in that place. And if you come back out, if you manage to escape, you will bring something back with you. Something that wears your face but is not you. Something that slowly steals your mind piece by piece until there is nothing left of the person you used to be, but an empty shell standing on the shore of a dark river with pockets full of stones.